Great. Well, again, thanks for inviting me to this. I'm really excited about getting into the Iroquois myths. And what I'm doing with this kind of introduction is just showing some of the concepts, but also some of the Native American stories that I've looked at from other parts of North America, other nations that seem to have maybe some parallels or some elements that might help us as we're going into the Iroquois story. Because I've looked at the Iroquois story with Kyle, and that video is up. And of course, we're going to be looking at it more closely. So I've just chosen a few examples to help illustrate how some of these stories have the celestial components that will help us as we look more specifically in the text Trina has picked out for us. So I was showing some images from the 1935 publication by Anna Gayton, where she was calling it the Orpheus myth, because she's familiar with the Greek story of Orpheus, who goes down into the underworld. And we talked about it briefly last time. I'll just touch on it again a little bit in a minute. But she sees it happening in different nations across North America. And she says it's especially in the West. You see it a lot in the West. So you see it all the way up into the Pacific Northwest there, into Canada, modern day Canada and the coast, all the way up to almost Alaska, and all the way down in the West. The Navajo and the Zuni are the main nations of the Southwest that she talks about having this pattern. And then she says it's not really that common among the plains, all the different Lakota and Cheyenne. She doesn't find it there. There is some in the northern central area of modern day Canada there, but not as much in the plains. And then she says, but we do find it in the Northwest, where there's the Huron version and the Seneca. So that's kind of in the similar area of the Iroquois nations there. Seneca is one of the 6 nations. Am I right? Is that correct, or am I wrong?
Correct.
Okay, great. So it is found in all these different, all the way across North America, all these different versions of the story. And so she says, look, there's a lot of common pattern to the story, but then there's some of the details are different from one nation or tribe to another. And so she says, but they almost always have these common patterns. And we'll talk about, she gives an example using actually a Yokuts story, which is from the part of California near where I am. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So, but first, I just want to now bring in the stars. I'm going to bring in those stories that come from the Yokuts and from what Jean de Brebeuf recorded among the Huron. I'm going to bring that in a minute. But I just want to show, we talked about the Orpheus myth, briefly showing how this myth, the Orpheus pattern, is related to the stars, but it doesn't have as much of the celestial components as the North American versions that are preserved in the various stories that were written down in the 1800s, most of them. So in the Orpheus myth, remember, Orpheus was a young man who was gifted by the gods with musical talent beyond anyone else. He could sing and play this harp, the lyre, the Greek, it's like a small harp. You know, you see these really big harps that people play where they have to like rest the harp on the floor. This is a small one that you could just carry. And he plays the harp, and he becomes in love with Eurydice, and he's going to marry her, and it's the happiest day of his life when the wedding day finally arrives. But on that very day, and it's the happiest day of her life too, she's running through the grassy fields with her her bridesmaids, getting ready to go to the wedding. They're all just picking flowers and singing and having a lot of a joyful time. And she steps on a serpent and goes down into the underworld. And then Orpheus says, I'm not going to just leave her in the underworld. I've got to go down. I know it's wrong, but I've got to go follow her anyway. And he sings to the god and goddess of the underworld and plays his harp or his lyre and sings about how sad he is. And they say, well, you've melted our hearts with your tale of grief and your singing. You can have her back if you follow a certain, prohibition. And we find the prohibition changes in different, one story to another, it's different. But in the Greek story, it's that he can't look back. So I'm just going to show what the most probable constellations are for the Greek version, and then we're going to go to some of the North American versions. So Orpheus, we talked about the constellation Hercules, and I showed how there's these figures who are associated with this constellation, like Zeus or Chalk, and they have this characteristic posture. I'm not positive that Orpheus is associated with Hercules, but one reason why I suspect that Orpheus might be associated with Hercules is I spent a little bit of time showing that right next to Hercules is a constellation that is called Lyra. The ancients associated this constellation in Greece with the harp. And so in Greek myth, a lot of times you'll have a bard or somebody who will have to reach up and get his harp. And right above Hercules in the sky, you have this little constellation with a very bright star Vega, and it even has a couple strings of the harp there. And so I think that it's a good guess when you find someone playing a harp in ancient myths that they may be associated with Hercules because he's very close to, or that constellation is very close to Lyra. Then the other constellation we looked at down here was Sagittarius. Remember, we looked at that Greek vase with Artemis and Actaeon, and we talked about how Sagittarius looks like it's walking in one direction, but looking back in the other direction. We talked about some stories like in the Bible, Lot's wife is not supposed to look back. If she looks back, that will show doubt, or that will show that she's still too attached to Sodom and Gomorrah, and then she gets turned into a pillar of salt. Well, figures who are not supposed to look back or who are described as looking back are sometimes associated with Sagittarius, and you can see just from the constellation why that would be, because it looks like it's walking one way, looking back the other way. And then the other part of the Orpheus story is that Eurydice dies by stepping on a serpent. This is a statue of Eurydice. There's lots of different artwork showing Orpheus and Eurydice, but this one, it shows her with a serpent twined around her foot. You can see, if you look really closely, she's crossing her legs, and the leg that she's holding on to, if you look down at the foot really closely, you'll see there's a serpent. The sculptor has put a snake wrapping around her foot, because in the story, Eurydice dies by stepping on a serpent. And we find stepping on a serpent all throughout myths around the world. And I'm going to introduce one more constellation. We talked about it briefly last time. In between Hercules and Sagittarius, there's this constellation here, Ophiuchus. The very name Ophiuchus means the serpent holder. It comes from a Greek word that means serpent holder or serpent handler. And you can see that Ophiuchus, the constellation, if you look at the outline of Ophiuchus, it has a central body, which is kind of shaped like a tall rectangle with a triangle on top, like a tombstone or like an obelisk of ancient Egypt, or like a house or a hut. So sometimes Ophiuchus will play the role of a house or a hut or a cabin. Sometimes Ophiuchus will also play the role of a mountain, and you can see why. It's got that, kind of triangular top. But on either side of that central body is these two squiggly lines, that is the serpent that Ophiuchus is holding. One side has the head that's off to the right as we're looking at it. One side is the tail. But those two halves can turn into different things in different myths. We can get into that later on. But Ophiuchus is a very important constellation, which is why I'm spending a little bit of time talking about it. And not only is Ophiuchus holding a serpent, but right below Ophiuchus, I'm going to show another constellation, which we also looked at briefly, Scorpio, right there. Remember, Sagittarius is shooting a bow towards Scorpio. We saw this in that ancient Greek painting on the vase of Actaeon and Artemis. She was shooting her bow towards Actaeon. And I said his angle of his body and the way he's throwing his arms up in the air is clearly reminiscent of Scorpio. But usually Scorpio will play a serpent-like figure, and you can see why. It actually plays a snake or a serpent much more than it plays a scorpion. And I've drawn like multiple heads. You could connect the dots more like the pinchers of a scorpion, but I like to use a slightly different outline of Scorpio with multiple heads, because a lot of times Scorpio will play a serpent, sometimes with more than one head. You know, like in the myth of Hercules fighting the Hydra has 9 heads in ancient Greece. In the Greek myths, there's a serpent with 9 heads called Hydra. And even though there's a constellation called Hydra, I'm convinced that the 9-headed Hydra that Hercules fights is associated with Scorpio rather than with the constellation we call Hydra. But anyway, the main point that I'm showing here is that Ophiuchus is standing right on top of a serpent constellation. And in fact, that serpent constellation's the serpent constellation is right next to the foot of Ophiuchus. So remember, Eurydice goes down to the underworld because she steps on a serpent. So I believe that these constellations right here are the constellations that are playing the different roles in the Orpheus myth. Orpheus is probably associated with Hercules. He's got his lyre. Eurydice is probably associated with Ophiuchus when she steps on the serpent, at least. And then that part of the story where you can't look back seems to involve elements of Sagittarius. So sometimes it's not clear exactly which constellation is which. We don't have that many clues in this Orpheus story, but I believe that the going back from the underworld, probably he turns around to look back, and it has something to do with Sagittarius. Or it could be that he's just Hercules reaching down to help her up. You can see in the story, she gets all the way back to the very edge of the land of the living, and then he turns around to help her up. And you can see how Hercules looks like he's about to help up Ophiuchus, and that's when he loses her. So this is just showing how some of the elements of the story can be shown to line up with some aspects of the constellation. But now I want to jump into the Native American versions of this same pattern. They're not involving Orpheus and Eurydice, they're involving different characters, but the same pattern of a young woman, young wife, usually just married, or the beloved wife of this young man. She dies somehow and goes down to the underworld, and he goes down to try and retrieve her, and usually he's unsuccessful, just like in the Orpheus pattern. And usually, just like in the Orpheus pattern, when he goes down to the underworld, they say, well, it's very, very unlikely that you'll be able to get her back. But if you don't do this, then maybe it'll work. And he has to not do something. And usually he's not able to keep up he's not able to follow the rule or rules that he's given, and he loses her, just like in the Orpheus story. So Anna Gayton gives a couple different examples, and I just want to look at this one as a very helpful illustration of how the Native American version preserves even more elements than the Orpheus version, but is still talking about the same part of the sky. We'll go to the constellations in a minute after we look at the story. So I'm just going to zero in on this. She says, just above the box that I've circled here or highlighted, just above that, if you read it, but it says, to furnish an acquaintance with the Orpheus myth. She's calling it the Orpheus myth, but like I said, the Native American version have even more details than the Orpheus version, so it's really kind of backwards to call it that, but she's using a Tuolumne Yokits version. She says it will serve as an example of the form which this folktale takes in the South Central California region, which just happens to be near the area where I live. I'm in Central California region. So it says here, Tipiknits. I don't know if I'm saying the name of it right, but Tipiknits or Tipiknits is the land of the dead. It says it is towards the west or northwest, and that's a common pattern that Anna Gayton talks about. A big river is there. A big river is there. And we find a river, by the way, going to the land of the dead in myths around the world. We just, talked about ancient Greece. There's the river Styx in ancient Greece. But in the Norse myths, there's a god named Balder who goes down to the underworld. And the son of Odin goes down to try and, one of the sons of Odin goes down to try and rescue Balder, and he has to cross a river to get to the land of the dead. So anyway, this is a common pattern around the world, and I would argue it's because of the stars. But anyway, I'm going to keep reading. A big river is there, and over it is a little bridge that moves up and down while a person is crossing it. It stops when one gets off. So this bridge is unstable. It's unsteady. And remember, Jean de Brebeuf, when he was recording what he learned from the Hurons, he was talking about how the bridge was unstable also. There was once a man who had a very nice wife. She was skilled in all her household tasks. She died and was buried. Her husband decided to follow her to the next world. She would stay in her grave 2 nights and 2 days before she would get up. Her man went to the grave and said to himself, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to watch you. Where you're going, I'm going. He hollowed out a little place in the ground and lay down in it. On the second night, just before dawn, when objects could scarcely be seen, the woman got up and arranged her clothing. She had a bead band on her head. She shook out her hair and replaced the ornaments. She shook out all her beads. The man cried as he watched her. Then she started to walk off. She staggered just as if she were drunk. She looked all around to see which way she should go. She went west, and her man followed. She looked back and saw him, but she ignored him. They walked 1 night and 1 day before she spoke. What are you doing here? You're alive. You can't cross that bridge. You'll fall in and become a great fish, she said. Then they came to the bridge. So he's being warned away. That's another pattern that is found in all these different, or many of the different versions that Anna Gayton talks about in this article. They came to the bridge. In the middle of the river is a bird, killdeer, who tries to scare those who are crossing by suddenly saying, cat, cat, cat. If a person loses his balance and falls in the water, he becomes a fish forever. The woman went on the bridge and crossed safely. The man began to cry again. He had with him an eagle down rope. And then in the parentheses, someone has put this explanation, a talisman of his supernatural power. So somehow he got this special rope, and it's made of eagle down. So that's interesting. This he threw across, and so he skimmed safely over the bridge. On the other side were his wife and many people. They were dancing the round dance, and someone has put in brackets again, the ghost dance form. Everyone spoke of the newcomer's unpleasant smell. They're like, wait, someone here smells like they came from the land of the living, because he was alive. The chief's messenger went to the chief, who's also called Tipiknits, and told him there was a living man there. Then he got out tule mats for the man to sit on. Then he called him to eat, and the messenger's wife came to serve him. And it goes on to the next page. Basically, the chief of the land of the dead says to the man, look, it's really unusual for you to be down here, but if you can stay up all night, she can go back with you. And so he stays with his wife and talks to her all night, and they're just overjoyed to be together. But just before morning, he falls asleep. And then the chief tells him, hey, young man, you failed. You're going to get one more chance, but if you fail again, you're going to have to go back to the land of the living without her. And of course, the exact same thing happens. He stays up all night. He's enjoying talking to his wife. They're having so much good conversation together, but he finally falls asleep. He can't stay awake, and he ends up having to go back to the land of the living. And something like he tells his parents about it, and they're like, "You can't tell anyone this. If you tell anyone this, you'll die too." And somehow the story gets out, and he gets bitten by a snake and goes down to the underworld as well, so to join his wife. So that's this version that Anna Gayton cites. But here on a couple pages later, I'm not going to read the whole entire thing, but she says at the very top, "This story was told to my informant when she was a child by an old Tuolumne Yokuts man. She said it was told to children so that they would not run far from home and be bitten by rattlesnakes." So it's interesting that there's like a don't get bitten by snakes component that's similar to what we saw with Orpheus and Eurydice. But down at the bottom of the same page, the reason I put it in here, it says, "A similar form of the story was well known to the northern neighbors of the Yokuts, the Miwok, according to Hudson." So this is recorded. This is this is all California, the Yokuts and the Mono and the Miwok. So in the upper Merced River. So this is all kind of in the same area where when I was growing up, I went to the Merced River and things like that. But I'm going to just highlight this very short little, another version. "The soul hovers over the body 4 days. Then it goes to the spirit world, Olowin, in the west, taking along all the property with which it was buried. It knows the road, for it is from there that newborn spirits come. The water there is enormous. There is no boat, only a long, frail bridge across it. Anyone falling off the bridge becomes a pike fish. Olowin is a place of happiness and plenty." So if you fall off the bridge, you become a fish. And that's similar to what we saw with the Yokut story. I think that one you become just said a fish, not a salmon. I think in some of the stories it's a salmon. So those are two versions that can give us some clues. I'm going to go back to the stars in just a minute, but before I do, this is from again Jean de Brebeuf. We looked at this briefly. It's at the very top. This is Jean de Brebeuf from the 1600s, so a couple hundred years earlier than those versions from the nations of Central California were written down. "Another told me that on the same road," I'm starting right at the top, "before arriving to the village, one comes to a cabin where lives one named Oskotarach." I don't know if that's how you say it. We could ask maybe someone who speaks Huron or knows this story, maybe Oskotarach. "His name means pierce head, who draws the brains out of the heads of the dead and keeps them. You must pass a river, and the only bridge you have is a trunk of a tree laid across and very slightly supported. The passage is guarded by a dog." So remember, in the other story, it was a killdeer, and the man crossed it with a rope made out of eagle down. But in this case, it's guarded by a dog which jumps at many souls and makes them fall. They are at that same time carried away by the violence of the torrent and stifled in the waters. So it's bad to fall into the river, but it's slightly different. I mean, the versions have some details that are different, but obviously there's a lot of similarities. So I'm going to go back to the same part of the sky that we talked about for Orpheus and Eurydice. Remember, she stepped on the serpent, and the rule that he had to follow was don't look back. In the version of the Yokut story, it was stay awake all night. In most of the versions that Anna Gayton cites, she says most of the time the rule is when she gets back, you cannot have sex with your wife. You two can't have sex for a certain number of days. It's like 6 days usually, I think. And of course, sometimes they can't even embrace, and like he falls asleep and they embrace, and then when he wakes up, he's just holding a rotten log. She's gone back to the underworld. So in every case, the rules are slightly different, but in almost all the stories, he's not able to follow them, just like in Orpheus, and it doesn't work out. But let me show some parts of this story that are not included in the Orpheus myth, but are found in the versions that we just read. So here's that lyre up there again, Lyra, and then here's Sagittarius down here at the bottom. And this is the region of the brightest part of the Milky Way. It's that very bright, column. It's on the recording. It should be very easy for everyone to see on their computer or phone screens. But on the Milky Way, the brightest part, this is a very important part of the Milky Way for different myths. I'm going to introduce Virgo over here. She's lying down on her back. I actually wanted to bring in, before I brought in Virgo, we'll talk about her in a minute. You see how I've drawn two lines there in the Milky Way? In this part of the Milky Way, there's a dark stretch that goes across the Milky Way that's called the Dark Rift. It actually is still called that today by astronomers. And it's right above the galactic center or the galactic core. And in some myths, this is seen as the birth canal. Like a lot of the interest around 2012 was centered around the Maya prophecies and the Maya calendar and the birth canal, the sun going through the birth canal on the winter solstice or the December solstice. So a lot more people started to learn about the birth canal or this dark rift across the Milky Way. But remember, in the stories that we've been reading, what have we been hearing about? A great river, a really big river. It's hard to cross. There's no boats. There's only a very shaky bridge. So this dark rift is like a pathway across the Milky Way. And it happens to end up right there where Ophiuchus is. And it's actually, if you're familiar with your Bible stories, you'll know that there's a crossing of a sea that Moses has to get the people across the sea, and he holds out his staff in the sea parts. It's the Red Sea. This is the same part of the sky that gives us the story of the Red Sea. And I've talked about how Moses is associated with Ophiuchus, and Ophiuchus even looks like it's holding its staff out and pointing right towards that crossing point. So that's the narrow bridge across the river in the story. I'm convinced that that's the narrow bridge. And I'll give you some more evidence to show that that's what we're talking about. Because remember, in the stories that we've heard, in one of the versions, there's this bird right in the middle that tries to scare you when you're going across the rift. And right here is a constellation that's known by its Latin name, Aquila or Aquila, which is a Latin word for an eagle. That's the eagle right there. And the eagle can play an eagle, but it can play other different birds too. I'm sure that that's the killdeer that tries to scare the man, when he's trying to cross the bridge in the Yokut's version of the story. He's trying to cross the bridge, and if you fall into the water, you'll become a fish. Well, right near the eagle, there's this little constellation. It's right above the eagle. It's called Delphinus, which is a Latin word for a dolphin. Delphinus, the dolphin, but if you look at it, you can see it in the night sky. It's in between the two big birds of the Milky Way. There's Aquila that's flying upwards, and just at the very top of our screen, I didn't outline it, but there's Cygnus the swan, which is flying downwards. In between those two birds is just off to the side of the Milky Way is Delphinus the dolphin, and it really does look like a jumping dolphin or a jumping salmon. So if the bird scares you and you fall off, you become a fish. And remember, when the Yokut's man was going across the river, he had a supernatural, special, magical bridge that was made from eagle down rope. So there's Aquila again, and you can see the long tail of Aquila. I think that has something to do with he used a special rope, an eagle rope, that got him across the bridge. And then here's Ophiuchus. And I talked about how just a minute ago, I've spent a lot of time talking about the Red Sea story of Moses crossing the Red Sea and in the stories of the Exodus, the book of the Exodus in the Bible. If you look at Ophiuchus, Ophiuchus is often a figure who carries a big stick or a staff or a spear, because those two lines on either side, you can see them as a serpent, but if you draw the lines through those stars a little more straight, it looks like a staff. And you can even see how Ophiuchus looks like it's holding a stick that's pointing right towards Aquila there. It's actually pointing right into that dark rift that is the crossing of this Milky Way. So in the Moses story, it turns into the crossing of the Red Sea. In this story, it's the shaky bridge that you have to get across, and there's an eagle or a bird, or in some cases, remember Jean de Brebeuf said, well, it's a dog that barks at you and tries to scare you. We'll see that dog in a minute. But also in Jean de Brebeuf's story, we have the hut. Remember, when you get to the land of the dead, you come to the hut where you find someone named Oscoterach, who is the head piercer or the brain piercer. He pierces the brain to take the brain out so that you don't remember your previous life. And so this Ophiuchus, remember how I said it could be also seen as a mountain. It could also be seen as a hut or a house or a cabin. Look, it's right at the end of the rope bridge, or the shaky bridge into the land of the dead. And there's the hut. And right above the hut is Hercules. That might be Oscoterach, the one who pierces the head. And the reason I think his name, I think that this is a good candidate for Pierce Head, the one who draws out the brains. First of all, he's above the hut. But second of all, sitting right in front of him is this guy right here, this constellation, which is known as Boötes. Boötes is the herdsman. So it's like he's sitting out in the fields, playing on a pipe, watching over the flock of sheep or whatever he's watching. But in this story, remember, you come to the cabin, and at the cabin you meet Pierce Head. And there's Hercules, and he's right behind the head of Boötes. And what's happening to the head of Boötes? I mean, you could think, well, Boötes is smoking a pipe, or Boötes is playing a trumpet or something, or a flute. But you could also see Boötes is having his head pierced. You see how it looks like his head's being pierced? And there right behind him is Hercules. So I think that's some of the details that are in this story of, the hut at the other side of the bridge where Pierce Head is. And then also Virgo. So Virgo and Sagittarius are both often associated with female figures in different myths. Not always. All these different constellations, like I think I said last week, will play both male figures or female figures in different stories. But Virgo will often play a female figure. She's lying on her back with her feet up, which in many myths means she's about to give birth, because that's kind of the position. It looks like she's lying on her back with her feet elevated and raised and slightly apart, and that's the position of giving birth. So sometimes Virgo will be giving birth in a myth, and often she'll give birth to a figure who's associated with Ophiuchus, because you can see if you just go right from her feet, it looks like Ophiuchus just was born. I know it's a big constellation, but she sometimes gives birth to Ophiuchus. Now, of course, it could also be that she's having sex, right? I mean, she's got her legs apart, and that happens in the myths too. The myths are not shy about all the different, things that they talk about. So Virgo is an important figure in the myths, but also it could be that she's in the land of the dead. I mean, she's lying on her back. So the journey to the underworld usually goes on our screen from the left to the right. And what we're doing in this you can see down at the bottom, if you look closely, it says southeast on the left and west southwest on the right. Basically, I've taken this screenshot, this image from the Planetarium Stellarium, which is a free online planetarium that you can use. I'm facing to the south. So that means east is to the left and west is to the right. So the land of the dead in all those stories is associated with the west. And it's the same thing in ancient Egypt. It was associated with the west. So the man is crossing down the bridge probably going from left to right, and he's going from the land of the living to the land of the dead, and that's where he encounters the hut or the cabin of Osco bless you, Osco who's up there and he's getting ready to pierce the head. So it may be, remember, he saw his wife in one of the versions of the stories. He saw his wife get up and she put a bead, some kind of bead decoration on her head, and she shook out her hair and adjusted her ornaments. That might be her on the left, Sagittarius, when she's heading down to the land of the dead. And then it may be that she ends up in the land of the dead. She becomes there with Virgo, like lying on her back. I don't know for sure. There's really not enough detail to be positive about all of these, but I'm pretty confident that we're talking about the right part of the sky, especially with, I've shown you some of the clues from the Orpheus myth as well. And it turns out that Ophiuchus, that hut that is mentioned by the Huron version of the story where Osco lives, Ophiuchus sometimes plays the role of the gates of the underworld, the gates of Hades, like in the Greek myths. And in fact, right underneath Ophiuchus, so underneath the feet of Ophiuchus also we mentioned Scorpio. And Scorpio, like I said, almost always plays a serpent-like character, but in the Huron version of the myth, Jean de Brebeuf said it was a dog that sometimes barks to scare travelers and souls off the bridge into the river. And I know Scorpio doesn't look anything like a dog, but it does turn out that those multiple heads, the brightest stars, there's either 3 or 4. I'm going to circle the brightest ones, and you can look in the sky. When you're looking for Scorpio, you might not be able to see all 7 heads or 9 heads, but you will be able to see the 3 brightest stars. So sometimes Scorpio does play the role of a 3-headed dog, like in the Greek myths where I talked about the gates of Hades, the gates of the underworld. They happen to be guarded by a 3-headed dog whose name is Cerberus or Kerberos. So I'm pretty confident in saying that Scorpio with the 3 brightest heads could also be Cerberus. As unlikely as it seems, sometimes Scorpio plays a dog. I know that sounds a little maybe unbelievable or hard to, but I've seen so many of these myths that I'm convinced that Scorpio does play a 3-headed dog. And here's the 3-headed Scorpio on a vase. And what's really interesting about this vase, you can see there's Hercules with his club. There's the dog that he's bringing back from the underworld. It's got 3 heads. It's Cerberus. There's 1 head there in red. The middle head is black, and then the top head is white in this ancient vase. But what's really interesting is the ancient artist has put little serpents all around the heads and even the feet of Cerberus. You see all those little mini cobras all over the dog. So it's really interesting that Cerberus, with his 3 heads, is somehow associated with a serpent that looks like it's kind of rearing up like a cobra, and look at Scorpio. So I put that in as an argument that this is the dog that Jean de Brebeuf is probably talking about. So in some versions of the story, an eagle scares you off the bridge. In some versions of the story, a dog scares you off the bridge. If you fall into the river, in some versions of the story, you turn into a fish. Look at all these additional aspects of the story that we get from the Native American versions that were not in the Orpheus story. So we're talking about the same general part of the sky, the gateway to the underworld in some myths. But in the Native American versions, there's even more elements of the constellations. There's you turn into a fish, or there's an eagle, or there's a bird that tries to scare you. So it's very, first of all, it shows a connection across, cultures that no conventional historians believe are connected. Ancient Greece and the Yokuts of California, or the Huron of upstate New York and modern day Canada, like who, if I walked into Harvard and said, "Hi, I'm your new history professor that you hired, and I believe that there's a connection between the ancient Greek myths and the myths of the Huron and the myths of the Yokuts," they would say, "Get out. we're sorry we hired you, you're fired. You know, but these stories, they're around the world, and the common connections are explained using the stars. So um, I'm just going to finish up, and then we can have, you know, some Q&A or other discussion. I just don't want to run out of time, because I know last time I kind of went a little right up to the end and didn't give anyone a chance for a break or any questions. This is actually right near where I live. I live in the central part of California. This is a rock that's called Morro Rock. It's like a giant volcanic, uh, hardened core of a volcano. There's actually 7 of them in a line, and this one is the one that goes off right into the Pacific. And I actually surf right next to this rock. We just call it the Rock. You know, like, where are you going today? I'm going to the Rock, or I'm going to Pismo. So this is in the central part of California, and this is Morro Rock, which is a pretty well-known landmark and famous. Well, the Native American nations that lived in this area incorporated Morro Rock into their myths. And I want to just briefly introduce one more story that we'll look at, because I think it has a few elements that maybe we can use as we move into the Iroquois creation account later. So this, and you know, it's also special to me because I love this, you know, I love this rock. I go surfing next to it. I mean, you know, take my kids to the beach there and things. But it's in the myths. It's in the myths of the Salinan Indians of the central coast of California that pretty much, I think most of their culture got basically, you know, wiped out by the Catholic missions over here. There was a bunch of missions that were put in California all the way up. There's like 15. And so a lot of their traditions were not well preserved, or I don't know how well they were preserved and survived. But this is a account from 1912. I'll circle it here. And you can find this whole thing online, which tells some of the stories of the Salinan Indians that are right in this area, right where I live today. And this is an interesting connection to some of the aspects that we see in the creation story. And this part of there's a whole book on the different cultural aspects of the Salinan Indians. And there's a little section, very small section, that talks about some of their sacred stories and myths. So if you see in the middle of the left page there on 192, it says, the destruction of the evil monsters. So I'm going to be reading from right there downward. It says, years ago, when all the animals were men, the country was full of monsters who preyed on the people. So I guess the people were associated with different animals. The hawk, realizing the gravity of the situation, persuaded the raven to help him rid the country of the creatures, these evil creatures that were basically devouring the people, I guess. First, they set out against a great rock named Exui. And again, apologies to anyone who actually knows how to speak Salinan. I don't. I may be wrong with my pronunciations. I just give it my best attempt. But that's the name of the rock, and I'll just highlight it here. So we got a hawk, we got a raven. This rock had the habit of catching people and killing them by throwing them back over his head, where a flock of little birds would feed on the bodies. From their custom of living on fat, these birds had become entirely black, and they were called Kateatsanii. Furthermore, the crow and shrike acted as sentinels for the rock. So hawk and raven are going to stop this, you know, man-eating rock, but crow and shrike are acting as sentinels for the rock. The hawk and the raven came peacefully up to the rock, and the raven, in a spirit of bravado, rubbed his eyes against the rock. They have been gray ever since. Then the allies went a short distance off of a hill. Now's the time, said the hawk. I'm ready, replied the raven, but you better go first. So the hawk approached the rock. which easily threw him over his head, but the hawk carried with him a little flute. The hawk has a little flute, and when he stood on it, he always alighted gently on the ground. So even if he's getting wrestled by this giant rock, if he's got his flute, somehow he turns out to be okay. That's interesting. Then the hawk beckoned the raven and said, "Come along." The raven was likewise easily thrown over by the rock, but as he had his little guitar with him, he fell lightly on that without any harm. And there's a footnote, because whoever was writing this up back in 1912 was like, wait a minute, a guitar? And down at the bottom it says possibly an aboriginal musical instrument using a bow. They don't really know. But anyway, it's something that got translated into a guitar. So he landed okay too, because he had this little musical instrument of a guitar. "Well, we have escaped this time," said the hawk. "That's so," answered the raven. "This time I'll take the first shot." And he threw a stone at the rock, which left a dent in his head. Then the hawk took his turn and knocked the rock's head off. Then they chased away all the little black birds. Xu-yi, with his head missing, may still be seen not many miles above the ruins of Mission San Antonio. So they threw a rock which left a dent in the head, and then they just cut the head clean off. So that's really interesting to me, because in the story of David and Goliath, David hits the giant with a stone and then later cuts the head off. So that's really interesting. But there's also this part about the musical instruments, which we'll take a look at. There's not a lot of detail to go with here, so I'm just highlighting some of the parts that I think may line up with some constellations, and that I see as patterns that we can find in other myths around the world, so that by being able to see patterns across myths, that helps us to have more confidence. But I'm not saying I've got this perfectly figured out. But anyway, hawk and raven then went hunting for more monsters. And you see I've underlined the next monster they encounter is a terrible two-headed snake. We've just talked about a snake with multiple heads. So it's interesting. They're going to a terrible two-headed snake. When they approached, the snake, and this is a really difficult name for me here, but it looks like Taleya ka tapelta, was sound asleep. "Now is the time. He's asleep," said the hawk to the raven. They made arrows from some reeds growing there and shot at the snake. First the hawk hit him on one side, and then the raven hit the other. "Let's go before he gets up," said the hawk, and they flew away. They traveled swiftly in the direction of Morro Rock. All right, so they're going to Morro Rock on the seacoast. So Morro Rock is on the seacoast in real life. It's still surrounded on almost all sides by ocean. It's right there on the beach. But the snake came swiftly after them, breaking down all the trees in his way. "Come on, don't be afraid," the hawk, who was in the lead, kept calling to the raven. Now the dust was close behind, but the hawk said, "When we reach the morrow, we'll be safe." I'll underline that part. "The wind will help us there." Okay, well, I clicked to go to the stars, but that was the last part I really wanted to highlight. So at Morro Rock, the wind will help them, and then they cut the snake up, and the snake dies. So they defeat the monsters, so they've rid the country of the terrible monsters that were devouring the people. So once again, this is the same part of the sky that we've been looking at. The seashore, in this case, I'm pretty confident is the line of the Milky Way. And Morro Rock, which is right next to the seashore, is probably Ophiuchus. So there's Ophiuchus again, next to the Milky Way. Yeah, there's Ophiuchus next to the Milky Way. And there's the two great birds of the Milky Way that I talked about. In the last time we looked, I talked about Aquila, the eagle, or Aquila, the eagle. And then above Aquila is Cygnus, the swan. So it looks like one is flying upwards and one is flying downwards. So sometimes the little birds in the story, they might be Aquila and Cygnus, but I think actually that the two heroes of our story, which is hawk and raven, are probably Cygnus and Aquila. And the other little birds are probably, there's a constellation called Corvus the crow, which is on the other side of Ophiuchus it's down below the horizon next to Virgo. We saw Virgo earlier. It's not on the screen right now, but I think our heroes of the story, Hawk and Raven, are probably Aquila and Cygnus, and you'll see why in a second. Because remember, in the story, when they met up with the rock, Ixui, he easily threw them, but they were safe because one had a flute and the other had a guitar. And nobody knows exactly what the guitar was, but the scholars in 1912 who wrote the book thought it might be some sort of stringed musical instrument. Well, we're going to see in the creation story, remember there's a brother named Flint, and I know Flint is very important for the nations of the Iroquois, and you know, I'm not an expert by any means, but like just in the research that I've done, I think we're going to read a story that's in the Mohawk language. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the name of the people of the Mohawk, that's not their name that they used for themselves. It had something to do with flint, I think. So I think that flint and rock are a pretty important part of the story. Go ahead if you want to correct me on some of that info.
No, you're correct.
Okay, great. So flint and rock and mountains, they're very important in the myths, and they're going to be very important in the creation story. And a lot of times they're associated with Ophiuchus. And you can see why, hopefully, you can start to see why Ophiuchus looks like a rock or looks like a mountain. I showed you a picture of Mara Rock, which is right in the ocean. It's right there where the waves are breaking. And you can see how Ophiuchus is right next to the Milky Way, which could look like the edge of the ocean in the story of when they fight the serpent with multiple heads next to Mara Rock. Mara Rock itself is probably Ophiuchus, and the two halves of the serpent might be the two heads of the serpent might be the two halves of the serpent of Ophiuchus, or it could be, again, Scorpio with the multiple heads. There's not enough detail in the version of the story that we have preserved for us for me to be positive, but I'm very confident that both this giant rock that they have to fight named Ixui and also the Mara Rock that's next to the two-headed snake have to do with Ophiuchus. And then I'll show you why I think Cygnus and Aquila, the eagle and the swan, are probably the birds of the raven and the raven and the hawk in the story, which have, one of them has a flute and one of them has a guitar. So look next to Aquila. I told you about how in the story of Moses, he sticks his staff out to cross the Red Sea. It also plays the role of a flute in some myths, and I'm going to show you some evidence for that. But remember, one of the birds, the one who went first, which I think was the hawk, has a flute. Now look next to which one of these two would be most likely to be a hawk. Probably the one that we call the eagle. I mean, it looks like a bird of prey there, and right next to it is this flute. And the hawk was okay because he had the flute. Now the other one, what did the raven have? And I know Cygnus doesn't really look like a raven, but really interesting in the story, he had a little guitar. Well, what's right next to Cygnus? Like the two birds each have a musical instrument next to him. Lyra the lyre, which is the little guitar, or whatever that musical instrument is with strings that saved Raven in the story. So I think the rock that is trying to throw people over its back is probably Ophiuchus. And the serpent, the two-headed serpent, is either the two halves of Ophiuchus or the Scorpio down beneath. And the flute and the guitar, which are next to Hawk and Raven, are that part of Ophiuchus that I labeled flute and Lyra the lyre. Now, Hercules, the outline of Hercules that I showed you where it looks like a powerful kneeling figure, that's one way of seeing Hercules. But there is an alternate version of Hercules which I find showing up in myths around the world. And it may seem strange, and until you see the evidence, you may think, wow, this is kind of a stretch. But there's another way of outlining Hercules that just uses the head. You see that red outline that I've made? I'm using the head, and then there's like 4 arms spiraling out from that central head of Hercules. This is what I call the whirling or spinning or whirlwind version of Hercules. So Hercules figures are often associated with storms, with thunder, with thunderbolts. We saw the gods Zeus and Chak, who are both rain gods. We saw Indra last week, who's a rain god from ancient India. They are rain gods. They're clearly associated with Hercules, and sometimes they're also associated with whirlwinds and with wind, including the God of the Bible is associated with thunder and with wind. And I talk about that in my Celestial Bible tour, where I look at all these biblical verses a little closer than we're going to do right now. But just, if you don't believe me right now, just take it, trust me, that Hercules sometimes plays a whirlwind, and it's because of this outline. It can also sometimes play a spider, you can see why. Can also sometimes play like a scraggly looking tree, for the same reason. But Hercules will sometimes play a wind, or a god of wind, or a wind deity. So this wind is in a lot of different myths around the world. But in this story that we were just reading from the Salinan Indian sacred story of the hawk and the raven, where they're fighting the two-headed snake, they say, hey, when we get to Mara Rock, we'll be safer there because wind will come to help us. So it's to me, when I see that, it just rings a bell. Like, the story doesn't have that many details to go on, but it does talk about the rock is next to an ocean, and when we get there, there'll be a two-headed serpent, but the wind will help us there. So I just want you to see how Hercules can have a different outline, and so figures associated with Hercules will sometimes also be associated with wind. So in this story, we don't have a lot of details, but we do have two heroic birds, one of whom has a flute, one of whom has a guitar. They fight against a big rock, and they fight against a two-headed serpent, and when they get to Mara Rock, they think, well, the wind will help us there. So all these elements are celestial clues that, to me, suggest that these are the constellations. This is the region of the sky that they're talking about in that myth as well. And this is a very important region of the sky. And I'll just show a little more evidence from a myth from ancient India, from the Sanskrit Upanishads of ancient India. This is a god whose name is Krishna. He's very famous. Krishna helps people in all different ways, but in one of the stories, there's a terrible serpent, a naga, whose name is the Kaliya Naga. Nagas are like a serpent. They're like almost a divine serpent in the myths of ancient India. And they usually live in the water. And a lot of times they have multiple heads, but they're associated with a cobra. And this one very powerful Naga, or Nag, the Kaliya Nag, is living in the river, the Yamuna River. I'm just going to tell the story quickly. I've told it in greater length in other places, and I've written about it in some of my books. But in this very famous story, which they still reenact this story every year in certain villages in India to this day, where they'll have a young man from the village, like a 15 or 16-year-old, will play the role of Krishna, and he will jump into the river to fight the Kaliya Nag. This Naga, usually the Nagas, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're harmful, but if they stay within their boundaries, then they're good. But this Kaliya Nag was getting way outside of his boundaries. He was poisoning the whole river. He was killing all the livestock and animals and everything that came down to drink at the river. Even birds flying over because of the poisonous fumes coming out of the river would fall dead into the river. And so Krishna said, I'm going to put that Naga, Kaliya, back in his place. And he pretends like he's playing ball. He's like in the form of a young child or a young teenager. And he's playing ball, and he lets his ball fall into the river, supposedly by accident, but he wants to have a confrontation with the serpent. And all the people say, hey, kid, don't go chasing that ball. There's a terrible, powerful serpent in there. And he goes, nope, I'm not afraid of him. And he jumps in, and they're like, oh, that kid is dead. He just jumped into the poisonous river with the Kalia Nog. He's jumped into the river. He's dancing on the head of the Kalia Nog. Here's how you spell Kalia. And he's one of the Nagas, but usually they don't pronounce the last A a lot of times. And he's dancing on the head, and you can see he's holding a flute out to one side. And as he gets heavier and heavier, Kalia realizes, wait a minute, I'm in real trouble. This is not an ordinary human. This is a god. And Krishna is going to crush the life out of Kalia if he doesn't stop. And all of Kalia's wives come up, and they're begging Krishna, please stop, please spare him. We know he did wrong by poisoning the river, but if you would just let him go somewhere else, he'll behave, and please don't kill him. And Krishna does. He says, look, Kalia, you've gotten outside of your boundaries, but if you go live where you're supposed to live and don't harm all the people and animals, then you can live. And so Kalia goes off and does that. So I'm going to show a couple more pictures of it, just to show that side of Ophiuchus can be a flute. See, Ophiuchus is dancing on the head of Scorpio. You see that? We talked about it with Eurydice. She steps on a serpent. In the case of Krishna here, he's dancing on the heads of this multiple-headed serpent. I know in this picture it's only one head, but in other pictures, Kalia has multiple heads. And when they reenact this every year in the village where they do this outside of the river Yamuna, they usually have they have like a big fake multi-headed cobra, and whoever is chosen to play Krishna, dresses up like Krishna and stands on top of the heads of this serpent in the water. And they, it's a ritual that, like a celebration, a festival that they do every year. So you see how the flute, see how Ophiuchus is standing on Scorpio, and then right on the exact same side as this picture, if we go over here, there's the flute. And I said in the story of the hawk and the raven, one of them has a guitar, that's Lyra next to Cygnus. One of them has a flute, that's connected with the same flute that Krishna is playing. Here's another picture where you can see the multiple heads of Kalia, and you can see again, he's playing the flute off to one side. That's because Krishna is associated with Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is a really important constellation in the myths, and that's why I'm spending a little bit of time here, and I'm pretty convinced that Ophiuchus is connected with the mountain and with Exui and with Flint in the story of the two brothers. And so Ophiuchus is like a central important figure. But in this case, the flute of the bird, I'm just trying to prove that, the bird that has a flute and the bird that has a guitar, I've properly identified them in the sky. And here's just one more. This is a modern picture of they make these different like statues for the celebration of Krishna dancing on the Kalia. You can see how it's got multiple heads. And then look over at Ophiuchus on top of Scorpio, and you can see how Ophiuchus is standing on the heads of the multiple-headed serpent. And I put like a version there so you can see it. And also the wives that are putting their hands together and begging Krishna, please don't kill him. Who do you think, if you had to guess, which constellation might play the wife or the wives of Kalia that are coming over to Krishna and saying, please don't hurt him? I would guess it's Sagittarius. And you can see that the bow is kind of right in the position of where the praying hands would be. And actually Sagittarius figures will sometimes play like a priest or a holy man or someone whose hands are tied together. So the bow could be a bow, the bow part of Sagittarius, but it could also be folded hands. It could be a lot of different things. It's envisioned as different things in the different myths. But what I'm trying to show here is that we have this pattern that's worldwide, and it's a little tricky to see it at first, but when you look at enough myths, you start to see these clues. And so as we go through the creation story, I'll try and, offer up some interpretations as best I can. And it's not always positive. Sometimes there's a lot of clues to go with where you can have a lot of confidence. Yes, I'm very sure that Moses crossing the Red Sea is Ophiuchus and that path that I showed you. And I'm very confident about the story of, going down to the underworld, the difficult bridge with the killdeer, and if you fall in, you turn into a fish. When I've got a lot of clues like that, or with this one where I can show for sure that Ophiuchus is sometimes carrying a flute, that gives me more confidence. Sometimes we don't have as much to go on. So I just want to conclude. This is basically as much evidence as I wanted to show in the introduction to bring back to the original argument that I'm making, that these ancient myths, they're all celestial and they're all connected. And this has a lot of profound implications for us today. And we can talk about those, but I'll just say really briefly what I'm not saying that they're not true. I'm not saying, oh, these stories aren't true, but I am saying they're celestial and they're probably metaphor. They're telling us something that's true, but it doesn't mean that necessarily they actually happened. Like, I don't believe that you have to believe in Hercules as a real live historical figure to get the important meaning that the Hercules stories are trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us something really important about our life. Or the story of Odysseus from ancient Greece. It's one of my favorites. I've read it so many different times. It teaches me different lessons every time I read it. I'm not saying that it's not true when I say it's based on the stars, but I am saying I don't have to believe that it actually happened in order for it to have truth for me. Same thing with the story of Moses. I don't believe that the story of Moses had to actually literally happen in human history for it to have important things to tell us. I believe they are celestial. They're telling us about the invisible world, spirit world. We can't see the invisible world most of the time, but we can see the stars, and the stars are in the infinite. When we're looking up into the sky, we are looking into an infinite world. So this ancient system is using something really profound, something that is infinite. They're showing us something that can't be shown in a very profound, ingenious way. They're showing it to us with pictures using the stars. So I'm not saying they're not true. I run into this a lot when people say, wait a minute, you're telling me the Bible's not true? It's usually like people who believe the Bible has to be literal. It's like, why does it have to be literal? Is it okay for Hercules to not be literal? Oh, of course. Well, does that mean that the Hercules stories are worthless? No, they're not worthless. They're very, very important. But it doesn't mean that they necessarily happened in this terrestrial, literal world. They might have happened in the infinite realm or in the invisible realm that we have to learn about. And it has lessons for us where we are here. I believe these stories, they're not about the past. They're about where we are right now. They're for each of us today. So that's all I'll say. I'll stop talking. We already went all the way to 9 o'clock. But if you want to ask some questions, or we can save it till later. I see that, is that Rhonda?